Our reading for this morning is from Luke chapter 15. Karen Alexander is going to be reading that to us. So if you would you please stand for the reading of God's word from Luke 15.
Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he had come to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare, but here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out the robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder brother was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he's gotten him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out to him and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat, so I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours.' But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead, and he has come to life. He was lost, and he has been found."
The word of the Lord. So in this parable that Jesus tells, there is this son who leaves everything, and so he gets the name the prodigal son. So that was a parable from Jesus. Now let me give you a metaphor of a different son who has kind of a different experience with his parents. So let's take a look at this video right here. We have a young boy who is very hungry, and he wants to eat a banana, but no matter how hard he tries, he just can't get the banana. There you go. In Jesus' parable, there is a good father who's there for his son. In this metaphor, you have a parent who would rather just videotape their son struggling for a while until they finally help. Can you relate to that, though? Where you have this sense that what you want, what you need, what you really have to acquire is just beyond your grasp. I know some of us have experienced that, especially over the last few weeks, when we've been told to shelter at home. And even though in our near proximity are countless places that we want to go to, we have countless friends that we want to associate with, we just can't access them. We just can't reach them. Some of us right now know that this is NBA playoff time, and it's the time for the NBA playoffs to be going on, but we just can't see it. And if you've ever found yourself in that experience, like the boy with the floaties on his arm, where you just can't get what you feel like you have to have, what I want to tell you today is you're not the first and you're not the only one. This has been an age-old experience of people who want what they can't seem to get until they give up the very things that are keeping them afloat so they can try to get it. In Jesus' parable, the prodigal son has this sense that what he needs, what he has to have, what he needs to acquire is beyond the walls of his family's property. And so he does the unthinkable thing and tells his dad that he would rather have his father die so that he could get his inheritance. He disrespects his father, but his father still gives him his part of the inheritance. And once he has his father's money in his possession, he sets off. In verse 13, it tells us where Jesus tells us where this son set off for. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, and by all he had, it's really all the father had, and he set off for a distant country. And there squandered his wealth in wild living. The distant country. That's the metaphor Jesus uses for where the prodigal son goes. And for some of us, we've been to the distant country in prodigal son type ways. When many of us think of the distant country, we probably imagine this drug or alcohol-fused bender in Las Vegas, where we're squandering what our family has for our own desires. And that's definitely the distant country. But if we think of the distant country just as those sort of big, spectacular ways of running away, we distance ourselves from the truth that is in this story. That the distant country isn't just something that the prodigal son or the black sheep of the family has gone to. The distant country is something that every one of us has gone to. Because the distant country isn't defined simply by prostitution or drugs or alcohol. The distant country is any time that we have become distant from who God created us to be. When we are far from God's best for us. Now, during this time of social distancing, many of us experience a distancing from a lot of the practices that helped us be the best version of ourselves. A lot of the things that kind of remind us of the way that we want to live, we find ourselves kind of out of those routines. We don't have the chance to get together with the people who hold us accountable. We don't get to go to the places that kind of help us go in the right direction. And so we end up like this father right here, the not so ideal father. Take a look at this video. Many of you can relate to this. Day 18 of quarantine. Right? How many of us parents have found ourselves wanting to do that? I can't take it anymore. Now, one of the things that's symptomatic of going to the distant country is what we often say afterwards. You do something like that, and then you kind of come to your senses and you say, I'm sorry, I just wasn't myself. The distant country is whenever we distance ourselves from who our heavenly parent created us to be. It can look like losing our temper. It can look like losing our morals. It can look like losing our convictions. But it's what we all become when we distance ourselves from who God wants us to be. The great Catholic thinker Henry Nouwen describes the distant country this way. He says, "It is a denial of the spiritual reality that I belong to God with every part of my being, that God holds me safe in an eternal embrace, that I am indeed carved in the palms of God's hands and hidden in their shadows. Leaving home means ignoring the truth that God has fashioned me in secret, molded me in the depths of the earth, and knitted me together in my mother's womb. Leaving home is living as though I do not yet have a home and must look far and wide to find one. The distant country is marked by ignoring the truth that God says about us. And every one of us has made that trip to the distant country. It would be 2 years ago from the holiday that we'll actually celebrate next Sunday, and my whole family was at home in our living room. My wife and I, we were sitting on our couch, and our daughters decided for some reason that they wanted to stunt. Now, our daughters are in gymnastics and cheerleading at the time, and so it was not uncommon for some semblance of the three of our daughters to want to put a stunt together. If you don't know what a stunt is, it's when two of them pick up the other one in the air. And the easy way to stunt, of course, would be for the two older ones to pick up the youngest one, but as many of you know, stunting ain't always easy, so it's always some different mixture of that. And this afternoon, they decide they're going to start stunting, but before I want a pyramid of my progeny over tile floor, I tell them, wait. Go get the gymnastic mats that are in the closet just right over there, and then put them on the ground, and then you guys can proceed with your stunting. And so they relent, they pause, they go to the closet, which is just 10, 12 feet away. They get these gymnastic mats, and they start to haul them on to the living room floor while Lindsay and I sit on the couch and get a brief moment of reprieve from a busy day. And somehow in the few seconds from the closet to the center of our living room, these mats no longer are brought out for the sake of building a stunt, but instead they decide they're going to make a fort. And so these mats are set on their end, wrapped in a circle, Velcroed together, all in a matter of seconds. And then this tornado of activity ensues. Pillows are repurposed for the floor of this fort. Blankets are thrown over the mat to decorate it. There's a sign that is dropped on the front of the mat that says, "This is property of Avery, Adeline, and Audrey." And Lindsay and I are just going, hey, this isn't too bad. The kids are all inside of this fort. They're kind of occupied in this little cage. And Lindsay and I get this brief moment of reprieve from a busy day. And we enjoy this few minutes. I'm starting to kind of nod off, but as I often do on a Sunday afternoon, I have those shoulda, woulda, coulda thoughts that many people who do what I do have on Sunday afternoons. Oh, I should have said that this way, or I could have said it better, or if I would have thought about it, then this is what I should have done. And while that's common for people in my profession, it's not just common for people in my profession to have those thoughts. We all have them in our own unique ways. And so I'm kind of falling asleep, but I'm also kind of regretting what I could have done better. And then this request is lofted over the fort. And the request is, "Mommy, Daddy, come in the fort with us." A quick assessment of our couch compared to the floor, and I realized this is far less comfortable to go into the fort, so I don't really want to go, but then my wife makes me. And so we go into this fort, and all of a sudden, I'm not nearly as comfortable as I was. And I don't have the mental space to let my regrets occupy my thought patterns. And I have, instead of the regrets and the should'ves and the would'ves and the could'ves in my head, I have this sense of, this is right. Like, this is where I should be in this little fort that's no larger than a breakfast table. I have the sense that I'm home. I'm where I should be. And you've probably had those moments. It didn't have to be a fort in your living room with your kids, but there are moments where you feel like you're just at home, where that feeling like you have to have more, or that you should have done better, or things could have gone this different direction, or kind of put at an arm's length, and you feel contentment and peace. Some would describe that as being in God's will. But maybe it's more accessible to simply say, you're home. If the distant country is marked by being distant from who God wants you to be, if the distant country is marked by these thoughts of, I'm not satisfied with myself. I'm not satisfied with them. I'm not satisfied with this moment. I'm not satisfied with the way life has worked out for me. Then home is the exact opposite. Home says, I'm content that grace is enough for me. I'm content that I'm enough. I'm content that my people are enough. I'm content that my lot in life is enough. You're home. And when you're home, you have the realization that the prodigal son's father said to the prodigal son's brother. You get these words from verse 31. In verse 31, the father says to the older brother, "My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours." This is the mentality of being home, of realizing that God is always with us. And everything that God has is ours. And it's enough. Now, you can't satisfy every shoulda, woulda, and coulda. Life might not look perfect the way that you'd want it to look perfect. But you realize that God is always with you, and everything that God has is yours, and that is enough for you. You are home. So this is the first part of a series that's going to go on for a few weeks, and we're going to talk about this idea of the distant country compared to being at home in your circle. We're going to talk about how it's connected to the idea that I'm content that I'm enough. I'm content that this moment is enough. I'm content that they are enough. I'm content that life is enough. And we'll flesh that out over the next few weeks. But what I want to talk about for the rest of this morning is that thing that keeps us home compared to going off into the distant country. The thing that keeps us in our circle. It says right here is enough. So 2 years ago, when I'm in this fort with my daughters, I have this thought that goes through my head of a proverb. It's from Proverbs 25, verse 28, that says, "Like a city breached without walls is one without self-control." Like a city that's been breached, it doesn't have its walls anymore, is someone who doesn't have self-control. It's kind of like the story of the ancient town of, I just forget the name of the town. I'm getting old. It's the story of how the Israelites marched around for 7 days. They marched day after day for 7 days until the walls of Jericho come crashing down. And after 7 days, the town of Jericho is like a city breached without walls, and it has no longer control of what it is anymore. And that's like us without self-control. We just lose the ability to control ourselves. And we just end up making our way to the distant country. But the thing about walls is that walls can feel great, they can feel securing, but they can also feel confining. That on the inside, they might feel great, but on the outside, they might be terrifying, or vice versa. It's like our kid with the floaties. Let's go back to the picture of that kid. Here's that kid. And in this moment, he thinks the very worst thing in his life are these floaties that are stuck around his arm, because they're preventing him from having the one thing he wants the most. But he doesn't realize that almost without question, the most dangerous thing in his reality is just a few steps behind him. And the thing that will keep him afloat and alive is the very thing that seems to be confining him right now. It's his floaties. For the prodigal son, the walls that surrounded his father's property seemed to be confining him from that which would satisfy him. And he wanted to tear him down so he could get to the distant country. And so my question for you today is, what are those walls? What are those things in your life that maybe you still have, or maybe like the prodigal son, you've already torn down so that you can get to the distant country? What are they? What are those things that are keeping you where you should be, or the things that no longer are keeping you where you need to be? Because here's the thing about a good wall. A good wall mutes the voice of the distant country that says what you need is out there. And it amplifies the voice of the Father that says, I'm always with you, and everything I have is yours. So the question is, what are your walls? What are those things that mute the voices in your head that say, what you need to be satisfied is out there? And instead amplify the voices that say, God is always with you, and everything that God has is yours. Is it community? Or some spiritual disciplines that you practice? What are these things that intentionally do that for you? What are your walls? Because the thing about a good wall is that it keeps you home. But the truth is, some of us don't feel like we're home right now. Some of us feel like we are outside of home. And if that's you, I think there's a word for you today too. These past few weeks for many people have been very challenging. And we found ourselves acting in ways that maybe we don't ideally want to act. We found ourselves making choices that aren't in line with the kind of person that we want to be. And I think there's some gospel for us too. You see, the story about the prodigal son is he goes away, he blows all the money that he took from his father, and then he's working in a pig pen, a place that no Jewish person would ever want to work because the pigs are unclean, and so in their mind they would never want to debase themselves by being down there. But when he's there, he has this realization. This is verse 17. Let me read this to you again. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare, but here I am dying of hunger? So two things from this verse. First thing, he has this moment where he comes back to himself. Because one of the first lines about the distant country is you're always distant from who you're supposed to be, which is why when we act as though we are in the distant country, one of the things that we often say is, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not being myself, okay? So he realizes, I'm not being myself. I'm distant from who I should be. And then what gets him back is a memory. And he remembers who his father is. He remembers. You see, the thing about a good wall is when you're on the inside of the wall, it's good because it reminds you that what's outside the wall isn't nearly as good as you think it is. And what makes a good wall is even when you're on the outside of it, when you look back at it, it reminds you just how good it is when you're back home. He's reminded of how good it is when he's home. And maybe some of us need these practices that remind us of just how good it is when you live within the circle. Of what life is like, of how you're intended to be, which is far distant from what you're acting like right now. And we all need these practices that remind us of what home is. And that's the reason we worship. That's the reason we have worship like we do right now. Obviously, this is not ideal. It's not ideal for you to be experiencing worship through a screen. It's just not how it's supposed to be. Worship is supposed to be something where we're all together. We're connected one to another. And right now, it's not ideal. Like Chris talked about a few minutes earlier in service, we have plans for when we get back together. And we don't know exactly when that's going to be, but we will communicate with you as directly as we can as we kind of sort out and discern what we think the best way for us to love our neighbors is. But when we do get back together, it's going to look different. There's going to be some practices that we put into place to keep each other safe. There's going to be some distancing that we work on. There's not going to be hugging like we used to hug. We're not going to be able to pass trays like we used to pass trays. But we're going to do it because we've got to get together and remind each other what we believe. And the reason we do this right now even though it's not ideal, is because we need to remember what our home is. Because it's so easy to listen to the voice of the distant country that says, if you go here, you'll finally get that thing that you think will satisfy you. You'll finally be enough. You'll finally be full. And what we need to be reminded of is that if you stay home, you stay in your circle, it might not always be comfortable. It might not always be exactly how you would design it if you had the ability to do it that way. But it's home. And it's home is where you realize that God is always with you. And everything that God has is yours, and it's enough.